what I'm kind of hoping to do is spend almost no time in a search center. So there's a lot of sessions which are going to talk about indexing with BCS and displaying data and how can we make the data look pretty coming out of search. What I'm primarily going to talk about is the IT pro side. So if you're someone that runs a SharePoint farm, needs to keep search working optimally, performing well, indexing the content that you want to index, that's what we're going to talk about today. What the front end looks like, what the search center looks like, we're not going to really touch on. So just to let you know who I am, I'm an engineering or a service engineer in the Microsoft Office division, product group, so to speak, where I basically work in the O365 operations team responsible for search engines on the O365 farms, both multi-tenant and dedicated, and also SQL operations as well. Although if you see my demos yesterday, you might not believe that. I'm fortunate enough to have participated twice on the MCM program in both the 2007 and the 2010 experiences, and it is an experience. And I'm an instructor as well in the MCM program for enterprise search. And then there's some details about me there if you want to contact me. My blog looks horrible at the moment, but just ignore the error page. And in terms of experience with SharePoint, basically I've been in SharePoint since before SharePoint arrived on the scene, and SQL operations as well. So what we're going to talk about in the first session is really what is a search service application. So we're going to go kind of start very high level. What is it made up of? What are the components? What parts are in there? What do they do? And then we're going to look at some essential configuration choices. So I know a lot of people who generally deploy search, it works out the box, they leave it alone, do anything else with it. That's fine until things start to go wrong, or until you want to do something a little bit more clever, like control your crawl schedules and that kind of thing. So we're going to talk a little bit about controlling those things. And then we're going to get deeper. So we're going to go more into the actual search engine itself, look at some aspects around tuning query, tuning crawl, some optimization parameters you can set in the search engine itself via registry or PowerShell to actually squeeze a little bit more performance or optimize the engine a bit better. So we're going to start with the basics. So basically search application 101. So if you think about what the search engine actually consists of, we effectively have a number of components, kind of starting at the top with the search center, which everybody's seen a search center. You've probably seen them in demos already this week. And then moving down through the stack in terms of how we connect to the actual content right down at the bottom. So we have from search center through the query servers, through the query processor, which we're going to talk about quite a lot. We have options for query for federation, so actually retrieving content from other locations. And then the concept of the indexing, what an indexing partition is, how we crawl content, what the crawlers are actually doing, and then the concept of connectors as well. And like I say, I'm not going to talk about things like BCS connectors. There's plenty of other sessions that are going to touch on that kind of content. Search primarily, and these are the four things we're going to talk about, the four areas we're going to talk about. So administration, query, crawl, and query processor. And probably there's no real thing that's most important than any other. Personally, when you start to talk about things like performance, the query processor starts to become very, very important. And we're going to look at query processor both in this session and in the next session in even more detail. So just to kind of recap on what's in there then. So the administration function consists of an admin component and admin DB. Query, we have our various index partitions, and our query processor sits inside, our query component sits inside there. And then from the crawl side, effectively we're interested in these two guys here, the crawl component and the crawl DB. And like I say, query processor we're going to talk about in more detail. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take a look at what we've got. So what did Gary build for us, basically on day one? And hopefully it's all in one piece. Oh, nice. Okay, let's get on there. Sorry, I thought this connection was up. I said it is up somewhere. There we go. Okay, so central admin, application management, managed service applications, should give us our list. And here we have our SharePoint, or ISC SharePoint search service that was built, along with a proxy, obviously, for connectivity. So a simple look in here will show us one or two things. It should be all out the box, hopefully. I've always been playing with it. So we can see a few things in the status here. It's online for crawling, obviously. We've built the application. It's available to receive content. There's nothing in the index at the moment. So we're completely 0 crawled items per second and 0 queries per minute, so there's nothing going on either. Obviously, there's nothing to search. And then if we look down at the bottom, we'll see there's a little bit of work being done. Actually, someone's been playing. So there's a little bit of work being done to build 2 index partitions, as you can see here. And we've got our crawl components up there. So there's been some work done in here to scale out the search service application, in that we've got 2 crawl components, whereas by default you only get 1. We've got 2 index partitions again. By default, we would normally have 1 if you've seen an out-of-the-box search environment. So this will make the demo quite challenging later because there's been some changes, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to it. So as you can see, I mean, it's bar the basic scale out that's been done here, it's pretty much out the box. And there'll be nothing else configured in terms of how things look. If you look at the content sources, for example, it's a straightforward local SharePoint site. It's nothing special been done in here. So where do we go from here? We find my clicker. So what about setting up the basics then? So we're going to start, we've got our search service application. What's the first thing we're going to do? And the first thing we should look at is our content sources. So they're essential to discovery, obviously. Without a content source, you're not going to find any objects. And we know there are multiple choices in there. So I'm assuming everyone in the room at least knows what a content source is and is aware of the fact we can have SharePoint content sources, file shares, Exchange, Lotus Notes, custom, obviously through various types of .NET connectors. And Lotus Notes is one of the kind of key ones that's mentioned a few times. The important thing to note is that the default setup is not recommended. The reason for that is the default setup lumps everything into one content source. So all our start addresses end up in one location, which means we get one crawl schedule, which means we can only manage them as a single entity. So things become very painful for us. So the key thing we want to do is split the configuration. So that's the first best practice, the first common or good practice we're going to look at. The other thing is to think about the permissions. So from the content sources, we need to make sure that our crawl accounts have got full read permission on there. We need to make sure that our people crawl is configured on the user profile application. So in the previous sessions when they were building out user profile service applications, let's go and see if they did it right. Let's see if they let us crawl it. We'll find out. And then obviously to start the crawls, this myth about being able to index instantly in SharePoint, and the number of people that ask about that, I want to index my content now. I want an item to hit the directories, hit the files, the shared folders, or whatever directories you're using, and be able to index it within a minute. I don't know if any of you have had that request, but it's an impossibility with SharePoint. It takes over a minute just to spin a crawler up. That just gives you the kind of idea of how the process works. So it'll take a minimum of 1 minute to start a crawler. So what we're going to look at is just those content sources, and I'm just going to split them down. I'll just do a couple of them to speed things along. So I'll go back to the demo machine. And this is all, like I say, we're still very much in Search Basics 101 right now. So we can see our 3 content sources in here. The obvious one that's missing. Prizes for the obvious one that's missing. People search. Okay. So we're going to go copy those out, and we'll do a new one. Call it team. So we'll configure team up, and obviously this is where I can configure a schedule, so I'm going to leave things alone right now. What did I do wrong? I didn't clear the previous one. Okay, Search Administration 101. Delete your original ones before you move on to the next one. When I cleared them, I meant to clear them. Okay, so that's empty now. Just as a matter of course, if you decide, if maybe you haven't configured this, and you go away and think, okay, I'm going to do this now because I haven't done this before. I'm going to clear all my start addresses out of my local SharePoint sites, and then I'm going to set up some new ones. If you happen to be crawling while you do that, or you happen to initiate a crawl during this process, you'll dump the index. Okay, so all those start addresses which no longer exist in the system now are going to get deleted. So just be wary of that if you go down that route. Do this when you're not crawling. So it's a SharePoint site, and I'm going to just do the team one in here. Yeah, why not? And then we'll just do the people one. So the people one, importantly, if we look at our My Web Application, the important thing with people is obviously to change the protocol to SPS3 for people crawling. Another thing to note, unlike if you're familiar with SharePoint 2007, when you were doing user profile crawls, you always had to crawl the My Site host. In 2010, that's not the case. You can crawl any host that's associated to the user profile application proxy, and they will work. And we'll just leave it with those two. So you can see I've started to split them out. So then I'm not going to crawl the intranet, and I'm not going to crawl any other web applications we might have had out there. So we're just doing people, we're just doing team. I'll configure the other ones later. So that's kind of first step to do. And then the other thing we mentioned was, in the user profile service application, if I try and crawl that application, that content source now, it's going to fail. And it's going to fail with a permissions error, basically because the search service application will not have permissions on the user profile service. So if we go back to our service applications, look at our user profile service, and sorry, mouse. We can see that we have no SP search account in here, which is our default crawl account. I hope. And I can't spell. So there's our search, and the property we need in here is this last one down here. So if you see unusual error messages when you're crawling people, usually it's because this guy's not been set. And that should give us enough. So what I'm going to do is, while I move on, I'm going to kick a crawl going, just so we actually index the data that we already have. And then we'll move on to talk about some different things. And obviously in production environments, you wouldn't necessarily kick off two full crawls at the same time. Okay, so we'll leave that running. Okay, so nice and simple. That's kind of search application 101. So now we've started a crawl. What actually happens during a crawl? How does a crawl actually work? And the key thing to remember is, if we think about the way, there's two ways crawls can start. They can start via a timer job or via the search administration service, which is detecting your crawl schedule, which is my little egg timer down the bottom, or Elvis Presley can start it. You can choose. So Elvis Presley comes along and clicks do full crawl like I just did, and that sends a message to the admin components. So you remember the stack of components we were talking about earlier? The admin components at the top of the stack. It's the administrator of the whole service. Message goes to the admin component, which then drops a flag in the DB, in the admin service DB, that literally says, this content source, start crawling. There's another component in the search service called the master crawler. Now the master crawler is, well, by default it will be the first crawler in the environment. In a mature search application that's been going around for several days or well, months and years, the crawler may switch, so you might find it switches to a different machine. There's no real way to identify the crawler except if you pull its properties through PowerShell, or if you look in a supported way into the search DB. The master crawler component is polling the admin DB all the time, just looking for these. What am I doing now? So it detects the flag's been set. So it says, okay, we need to start a crawl. Here's a content source. Which databases are associated to those content sources? It puts a flag in that database. So in our instance we saw earlier, we have one search DB. So basically the master crawler puts a flag in that DB. Then all of the crawlers that are assigned to that DB, which in the out-of-the-box application or even in our partially configured application, is one crawl DB, which means all the crawlers must be associated to that DB. So they get the message to start crawling, and the request goes on. So the message goes to the crawlers. The crawlers, basically the master crawler will write the start address into the crawl queue in the crawl DB, and then those crawlers will literally just process that data. So they pick up the URL, they go out and do a request against the site data web service, they pull the data out, what content's hosted on that web application. And there's an iterative process whereby it constantly goes and gets new data, adds data to the crawl queue, adds data to the links list, and then it's distributing the data. So everything it finds, when it's actually gone out to crawl the content, it's pushed in mainly two directions, to the document properties table within the property DB, and the index fragments are sent to the query components. So they're pushed down to the on-disk index, what we call the Tripoli catalog. There's two other activities that take place. The first one being, hey, I've discovered some new stuff. You give me a start address and I've gone and found a load of new stuff. So that stuff gets pushed back to the crawl DB. So we get this content. Anyone looked at the administrative reports in SharePoint Search? Anyone looks at the crawl? No one's looked at the crawl queue reports. Okay, we'll try and show you some. So the crawl queue report will show you how many items are in the queue, how many have been processed, how many are to be processed. So if you want to find out when your crawl's going to end, it's a good place to look. This data all gets pushed down into the crawl DB, and it's the crawl DB that's mined to discover that data. Then any new additions are also added to that DB, so we end up with this queue that gets longer and longer and longer. Items are basically added to it like a stack. They're just popped on, popped off, and then eventually we get to the point where we're complete. Crawl's done. The other side of the thing that happens is we discover security descriptors. So all of the ACLs and access control entries for all of the items that we collect are pushed down into the administration DB. And we collect a list of all the unique ACLs that we find in that database. And in a nutshell, that's kind of crawl data flow. So that's what's going on in the background now after I initiated that full crawl. So what actually does get crawled? So there's various ways of crawling things. We mentioned about the content sources and what types of data we can crawl, but how do we control it? So the concept of crawl rules or crawler impact rules, with a crawl rule we can do some very simple stuff like include types of content, exclude other types of content. You know, how do I exclude all the Word docs from being indexed? Do it through a crawl rule. Very nice and easy. We support regex in 2010. So now that we've added regex expressions in there, it's much more flexible. It used to be a real pain and really difficult to do. You know, I want to crawl this file share or this folder, but I don't want those documents out of it. I just want these. That was a really difficult thing to do. Now it's much easier. And with crawl rules, we can support custom authentication. So if you have a file share somewhere, you want to authenticate against that file share with a different user. Maybe you've got some content in SharePoint and you don't want to authenticate as the crawl account. You want to authenticate as a site admin for a good reason. There can be various reasons like that. So you can add custom authentication providers or custom authentication credentials into a crawl rule. And then crawler impact rules is the single most easiest way to do a denial of service attack on your own farm. Okay? If you crank up the numbers in here, and you start telling the crawler it can have 256 threads and it can request 2,000 documents every time it hits the front end, you're very, very quickly going to take down your own farm. So just be wary of that. We'll look at the numbers, what you get by default, in a few minutes. The numbers, basically the number of instances I've had where people have come along and said, we've cranked our crawler impact rules right up and we're still crawling slower than ever. There's usually a good reason. Apart from the denial of service reason, you're literally saturating your SQL Server at the back end. Your SQL Server can't deliver that much content to the search engine. So smaller numbers in the crawler impact rules. So when it says how many items do I request, how many objects do I request every time I make a request to the front end, defaults to 8. If you scroll it back or crawl it back and set it to like 2 or 4, you might even find that actually improves your crawl performance, simply because you're making fewer requests, if you like, or more smaller requests to your web front ends. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And then file types. So what do we include? What's the most obvious omission that everybody wants? Is PDF. Why isn't it in the product? Well, I can't go into that, but I'd get sued. And it is the most requested edition. It is the one file type that everyone says it should be there by default and it should be an easy way to install it. And then obviously, how do we do this? How do we get PDFs in there? Well, we deploy an iFilter. So we're going to do a demo in a few minutes. We'll actually deploy an iFilter. But all really iFilters are designed to do is interpret the content that's coming back from the crawler. So when we talk about the crawler goes out and collects data, pulls information back from wherever the repository is, it's the iFilters that go away, actually smash that data up into usable chunks of data that can be passed to the indexing engine. So they convert a PDF into streams of text or images and things like that to push back to the indexing engine. Be careful with installing all of them. I had a customer that went to, wasn't that actual provider, but it was a different provider, and they bought every single iFilter they had, and they installed them all 272 of them. Each iFilter puts a resource overhead of memory footprint, because every time SharePoint encounters a file it doesn't know, it has to compare it against every iFilter it has in the system. So it's not only is it going to slow crawling down, it's going to consume quite a lot of memory on the system as well. So you will find the more iFilters you put in, the more likely it is you're going to slow your crawl down. So just make sure you've got the ones you need. Don't put anything extra in there. So in terms of those values, crawl rules, crawl impact rules, I'm going to have a quick look at those now, and then we're going to install the PDF iFilter as quick as I can do it. hopefully. So the first thing we looked at was crawl rules. Very straightforward. I mean, you can read the text there yourself. Basically, all we're doing is we add an entry that says, for this particular web application, do the following activities. So if or for this repository. So if I do a quick test on here, and I do something like, so I'm saying on my intranet, ISA.local, I'm going to say exclude complex and exclude all items. So we're going to basically exclude everything. If I okayed that and then tried to crawl it, we would obviously get a crawler, we'd get denied access. We're not an authentication denied access, but the crawler would be blocked from accessing that content. And any content you'd previously crawled using that content source would be deleted from the index. So you're basically saying don't index this content anymore. And you can build quite complex rules. And the important thing to note from a rule perspective is if you build, say, 20 or 30 rules in here, the order's important because it will always process the entry by the first one it finds. So if it finds an include, it's going to include the data. If it finds an exclude first, it won't. So if you're looking at quite complex paths and you want to include just content from part of the path, make sure your include rule comes before your exclude rule. Otherwise, you'll find you just exclude everything. And I'm going to delete this simply because it'll break something else later on. Okay, the other thing we talked about was crawler impact rules. So these are fairly straightforward. Again, we do a very similar thing. Not S. And this is where we can break things. So I can do something like this. Okay, that actually won't accept. It'll just drop it down to a default value. But you can see the problem here. In SharePoint 2007, this was a drop-down. And you could choose 2, 4, 8, 16, or 32, maximum. Here, it'll take up to 256 quite easily. So it's easy to break things. And then the other thing is we can be a little bit more careful by saying, okay, if I'm going to request a lot of stuff, I'll wait a little while before I request some more. So you can kind of control the experience. So if I'm going to go across a WAN to pull a lot of content back, I'm not going to be expecting to make thousands and thousands of requests over a long distance to pull data back. I can slow it down a little bit, get some data, allow it, give it some time to come back, then go and get some more. So it might lead to a slow crawl experience, but in this case, it might be actually what you want. So that's basically a crawler impact rule. It's a very, very straightforward thing to configure. And then the other thing we talked about was iFilters. So hoping on my desktop, I have this. And I'm going to put it somewhere a little bit more sensible. So the PDF iFilter is obviously there's two key ones. There's a number of them actually, but there are two main players in the game. There's Adobe and the Fox IT or Fox iFilter, however you prefer to say it. I have my personal preferences on which I prefer to use. I'll leave it up to you to make your own minds up on that one, but there's plenty of resources out there on the internet that will tell you which one's faster and which one gives a better experience. But fundamentally, it's a straightforward operation of click. Actually, there's something I want to do first. Important, where do we install the iFilter? On the crawlers. So let's make sure I'm on a crawler. I need a shortcut to my search engine. So my crawlers are located on 3 and 4, so I'm actually on the wrong box. So installing an iFilter here is not going to serve me any benefit whatsoever. The only thing that would be beneficial to install it on here is because this box is central admin, it will do things like it'll put the PDF icons in the right places when I run the additional scripts. But for now, what I'll do is I'll just hop off this box and go to 03. If I can get the RDP session running. SP03. So I won't install it on both. Remember that from yesterday. So I'm just going to run it on here. And it's a very, very simple operation. I'm assuming most people have done this. But that's not all the whole story. So one of the problems with the PDFi filter installation is the fact that you then have to go along and add various registry keys. You have to go and add icons into various files and various locations. docicon.xml, for example, is the classic one. You need to go in and add the PDF extension into there. What I have here, fortunately, is thanks to Agnes Molnar, who I don't think she's in the room, but she's certainly here at the conference. She's published this script file, which is extremely useful for doing all that work for you. ISC. Okay, remember the name of your search application or you're in trouble. ISC search service. Okay, you would have noticed the red rubbish there. So this, you can see what's happened. We've basically the way the thing kicks in, it's not found the right search service application because I clearly spelt it wrong or got the wrong name wrong because I missed the SharePoint out of it. Oh well, nearly as good as the demo yesterday. ISC SharePoint search. Okay, hands up, is that right? Thank you. Will, I hate you. Oh well, I got people laughing. The next demos are harder. Okay, so now we're good, I think. Oh, we're not good. Oh man. Invalid data, crawl extension. Okay, it did find the search service application. Okay, so there's actually, what's happening here is, you'll see that there's, this error here is caused generally by the fact that it tried to add entries to the registry for the PDF entry in the registry, which didn't previously exist. So there's an error in the script that actually doesn't check that it exists in the first place. And the reason we get the search service error is simply because we don't have Foundation Search running. So if it attempts to restart both services, it can't restart the Foundation Search Service application if we're not using it. But it does successfully restart the search service application here. So by the initial hiccups and by the error messages in the script, which are actually by design, we're in good shape. Now normally we would take this to all of the crawl servers in the farm and go and run the same thing to install the iFilter on each of the machines, but for the sake of time and effort, we will just leave it to the one. And we would obviously, in file types, I would hope, assuming it's found it, we would see PDF in here. If we don't, we do. There we go. So we've got PDF. Now remember I ran that on 03, so the docicon.xml file was only modified on 03, not on 02, which is where central admin is. So which is why we don't see the PDF icon here. If I was to go and run that file on this machine, not restore, I don't want to do that. So if I run the PowerShell script on here, get the name right, we should still get some error messages, but I'm hoping the PDF icon will now appear. So it should basically, what that script does, it should copy this icon here to the images directory in the templates folder, and then it should modify the docicon.xml file. And if you want this PowerShell script, even though it's full of red error messages, it does work extremely well. It's very quick. and it's available to download online if you need it. So if we go back to Central Admin, and as long as the demo gods are being kind to me today, or Will can shout out what I'm doing wrong, we'll let that refresh. We'll come back to that in a second. Come on. Okay, I won't leave that. We'll see that before we go. Anyway, before we move on to the next demo. So, is it done? It's done. And there we go. A demo that actually worked. Cool. Right, so PDF and the GIF icons in there. So that's a pretty straightforward operation. And to get the icon to appear on you via web front ends as well, you'd have to do the same operation. Modify the docicon.xml file, drop the GIF file in the images directory, and then you should be good to go. But moving on. So what about some other things then? What about queries and results? We looked at crawl briefly, crawl 101. What about queries and results? So a few things that you can do with querying to actually modify or improve the experience for the end users, things that people forget about. So authoritative pages. Anybody out there configure authoritative pages? 1, 2. That's crazy. Authoritative pages make an enormous difference to the ranking algorithm in your search engine. Basically, by default, your web applications should be added, the first web application at least should be added to an authoritative page anyway. But if you don't add more, you're just causing problems for yourself in terms of users saying, I can't find things. Things are not appearing in the right place. How can you make things more, kind of crawl things up and down? So anyway, sorry. The way the authoritative pages work, we're going to look at very briefly in a quick demo. I'm not going to go and re-rank the search engine just to prove it works, but we'll just see where you configure these things. And then metadata properties, clearly important from a metadata property perspective. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, and we'll come on to scopes and search result removal as well. But just to have a look at initially how the query engine works. So we looked at the crawl flow. So what about the query flow? So here's our Elvis Presley again. He's both the admin and the user at this point. He hits our SharePoint server with a query. The query is passed, well, not really passed to the search service application, but more the topology service knows where the components are and where our query processors are by interrogating the search service application, knows what's there. The query is then passed to the query processor. Now, I mentioned already that the query processor is probably one of the most important things in the search engine. Scale your query processors wrong and you're in trouble from a performance perspective on query. Inside the query processor, basically what happens, the query processor goes and reaches out to all the index components, all the query components. And it basically makes a request to each of the components in turn. We're going to look at this in the session later today. We'll look at how this really works under the hood. But basically there's a request that goes to each of the partitions, to a copy of each of the partitions, and there's a merge process that takes place. So basically go and get some data, bring it back and merge it together into a single record set. The other thing it does, it goes to the property DBs. It hits a table called MSS.results, which is a new table added in 2010 to improve the querying against property DBs. It basically contains only a partial set of the data, not the full set. So it makes it slightly quick. It's a quicker retrieval in SQL Server. That data is then merged together. So now we've got these two big data sets in memory. Those are then joined. So there's a join that takes place. If you want to know the details of how the join works, I can give you that detail later. It's quite complex and it depends on how you build the query. Well, basically it's a join of data. Then there's an access check. So the admin DB or the query processor, the security descriptor cache inside the query processor, does an access check to cross-reference your security against all of those objects it retrieves. Once it decides how many of them you actually have access to, it will go and do duplicate detection, and then it will do property fetch. So it's already trimmed you out by this point. So at the access checkpoint, it knows that every single object it has left in the query, in its data pool, if you like, or in its result set, you have access to. So then it basically goes back to the search DBs and pulls the rest of the properties out. All the properties you actually want to see in the search UI, all the heavy lifting, if you like, the summaries and all the data about the file that you might want to surface in the UI, it goes back and gets that later, rather than get it for every single object, even objects you might not have access to. And obviously then results are then passed back through the query data flow. So what about these things we talked about then? Authoritative pages. Anyone watch South Park? So authoritative pages, they affect the ranking. They're quite critical. And we're going to show you in a few minutes. There's a number of them. There's primary ones, there's secondary and tertiary. They basically affect, if it speaks for itself, if you're primary, you're high authority. If you're tertiary, you're lower. And then the final thing is non-authoritative. So non-authoritative sources. You might have web applications that are used for archive and you don't really want them appearing in search results, that kind of thing. So you can rank them as non-authoritative. Two ways to think about these slightly differently is the first one, you need to specify exact URLs. So if you specify the root of a web app, it's the root of the web app that's authoritative, not all of the sites underneath it. When you look at non-authoritative, it's different. Non-authoritative is effectively like a prefix match. So if you specify the root of a web app there, it's the web app plus everything underneath it that becomes non-authoritative. And then the last thing to think about when you look at authoritative pages, there's a little button that says refresh now. Authoritative pages, when you set them, they will refresh eventually via the crawling mechanism. If you do click refresh now, you will effectively re-rank the whole index in real time. If you've got a lot of items in the index, that's going to give you a serious performance hit on your querying engine. So just be careful with that. So metadata properties are the other thing, and these are, I guess, the thing that most people complain about. So I know certainly in O365, people are forever complaining about lack of management over metadata properties. Metadata properties don't give me what I need. Or you've mapped some crawl properties to metadata properties, and they're not exposing the right information. And generally, it's down to configuration of these two things here, whether you're including values from all map properties or whether you're including just single ones. So mapping a whole lot of properties to a single managed property isn't necessarily going to give you everything you want. If you've got one document, so you've got, if you look at this one, for example, this is the contents hidden managed property. If we change this to include values from a single property rather than all properties, what would happen is the first of those properties that had a value would become that value. That makes sense? So you would basically have, if everybody has a location, none of these would be added to that managed property. And it's a very common mistake that people make. They just assume that because they map it in there, it's going to work, because they don't set that top value there. A couple of other things that people do wrong. This reduced storage requirements for text properties. Great, turn it on. It reduces the footprint of your property database. That's a great thing, yeah? Small database is easier to back up, easier to manage. The problem with that is it then restricts what the queries you can do. So if you turn the reduced storage requirements on, you can then literally only do comparison queries. You can't do, or you can only do like exact matches, effectively. You can't do range matching, and you can't do things like show me all the values. Let's say you're looking for a date stamp file, and you want to do a query against a file. Show me all the files that were created since yesterday. If you've got this value set, you're not going to find them, simply because that's an illegal query against a property that has that value set. You can only do show me the files that are set to this specific date if you set that value. So again, another thing that people commonly get wrong. And the other thing we mentioned briefly was search scopes. So search scopes probably are one of the most critical things to use, especially when you're looking at environments. I mean, imagine very large, even think of O365 multi-tenant environment, or any of you might be running large site collections inside business units. By not configuring search scopes and just relying purely on this site or this list or all items, you're basically giving yourself a headache, because what you're basically saying is, when I issue a query to the search engine, I'm going to search everything and pull back results from everywhere. By using scopes, you can really target the information you want to find. But don't just think about it as being this site scope. Show me only the information in my site collection. Make good use of the properties that are in there as well. So all the managed properties that you can have, you can configure it against things like content types. You can configure it against people's names, name properties. You can configure all kinds of things with properties in there to make your scopes really, really valuable. They have significant improvement on query performance by using scopes instead of hitting everything. Rather than hit 20 million objects, just hit a few thousand. And they improve relevance as well, because all that garbage that you don't want to query against isn't included in the result set. You're only getting the data you're really interested in. A couple of things to consider. They do add to the disk footprint. Every single scope creates a set of files in the CI files folder on the disks on your query servers. It's not huge. It's not like another set of index, but it can become significant. It's just worth remembering. And then finally, security trimming timeouts on count. So if anyone's configured environments where you have lots of scopes, you might find that you get into a scenario where when you try and render the scopes page, it either times out or the scope counts are full of errors. I'm pretty sure most people will have seen that. That's usually because the security trimming timeouts. We only have a 10-second limit to pull back a scope count, and it's hard-coded into the product. If your scope is significantly large, that it takes longer than that to process it, it's got some complex rules, or it's got some a significant amount of data in there, then you're going to security trim and timeout, which can result in two things. If you have too many scopes that time out, the page generates an exception. If you've got a few that time out, you'll just get no count. You'll either get no count or you'll get an error message when you try and look at the scope counts. There's nothing we can really do about that. It is a bug in the product, but the way around it is you can manage them with PowerShell. So just a thought, if you get into that experience, you can manage the scopes with PowerShell very easily. There's two types of scopes predominantly. Service application level scopes, what we call shared scopes. So they're managed by central admin or by the search administrator. They can be shared. So typically you think of the two that you get out of the box, all sites and people. Those are typical examples of those. And also at the site collection level, where they can be managed by the site collection admin, and they're local to that site collection only. So you can't share scopes amongst site collections. The other thing we talked about, I'm going to show you all these in the UI in a few minutes. The other thing we looked at was search result removal. So this is kind of an interesting thing that happens when you do search result removal. So what happens is you put the URL of the object you want to remove. It's immediately dumped from the index, so you won't be able to find it. And it's done that by simply invalidating the object tackle. We don't go to the index, find the item, and pull it out. We just null out its security. By nulling out its security, we basically say no one has access. So basically what's happening is you're not finding it. It's still in there. It will be removed on the next crawl because we create a crawl exclusion rule. So those crawl rules we saw earlier, there'll be an inbuilt crawl rule created to exclude that object from the index the next time it's crawled. Definite recommendation, don't try and use it as a replacement for site visibility. I had a customer that did this. They wanted to remove access to or drop sites from index, and they thought, this is great, it creates these rules for me, it just does it automatically, so I can exclude all my sites by managing this. That's a really bad thing to do. Because I said the stuff originally, it remains in the index to begin with, and site visibility exclusions are a much better and a much more performant way of excluding items from the index. So we'll just have a quick look at those. It comes up. Yes, so if I go to this site collection here, the question was basically confirm what a site collection exclusion is. If we go to site settings, and the web app's warmed up, I did an IS reset, so it's slow. And we go to search settings here. We can choose, no, not in this one, search visibility I want, sorry. Where's it gone, where's it gone, where's it gone? I can't read fast enough. I can't see it. Where's it gone? Yeah, there you go. There we go. So that one. That's your search visibility. So by setting that, you're basically saying don't let anything appear in search results. This is an interesting one. These values here, they're worth thinking about. If you get people complaining that they can't find what they want, I've added a document to my site, and it's not available in search results. Have a look at these settings here as well. If you're using fine-grained permissions, the search engine is specifically designed to operate in a particular way, and generally it will not index things that are not, that are included with fine-grained permissions. So generally what you do there is you go and do that, and you'll find you'll start exposing ASPX pages and all kinds of things in your search index. So then you'll go back to your crawler exclusion rules, and you start adding rules to exclude ASPX pages, and it gets quite complex. Yes, it does. It basically says to the site collection administrator, you are in control of your own site. If you want your data to appear in the search results, then that's fine. In terms of this second setting here, you're basically saying the same thing. You're saying, I'm in control of my site, and I want this data to be available in search. What the site collection administrator can't then do, though, is go and add a rule to say, stop surfacing the garbage. Because by adding this value here, by setting that to always index, you're going to surface a lot of garbage out of the site collection. User disk pages or form pages that you don't really want. But yeah, it does take the control away from the site collection admin, from the central search administrator, yeah, for sure. Okay, so that was, where were we? Site collection. So if we look at the other thing we talked about, authoritative pages, see what we've got in here. So we can see here that, and I don't know how anyone was in, well, it would have been Gary's session first thing in the morning yesterday. I'm guessing here that the first web application he created through his PowerShell was intranet.isclondon.local. And that will be the one that will appear there by default. So what you would generally do here is, we have 3 web apps. We have intranet, we have Teams, we have My. We might decide that, well, okay, intranet is the most important. Teams might be second most important, and My Site maybe not. Or we could say, they're all 3 equally important. So we can add them in there, and we can add additional values in here, whatever we want to include that, make it to be configured how we like. And then the final thing, the non-authoritative sites, again, we just add our values in here. And like I said, the important thing to note is this is like a prefix match. So if I was to add intranet.isclondon.local into here, it wouldn't just make intranet.isc.local non-authoritative, it would make all the sites beneath it non-authoritative as well. Whereas that doesn't happen at this top level. We're basically saying only the root of the site. So the things you're likely to have in here might be your central publishing portal, for example, where you're publishing your main intranet content that you want to deliver to users that's accurate and up to date. So you make it more authoritative than anything else. And then with search scopes, we've had a brief look at. We'll look at the search scopes for the service application. This is where you'll see timeouts. So if you have some extremely large counts in here, because what's happening is the search engine, to show me that data, it has to security trim against every single object that it's counting. It doesn't just to say, make a guesstimate and say this is how much we've got. It has to go and load every single item, check that I have permission to it, and then tell me how many items are in it. In my case, it's quick and it's nice and easy because I'm the administrator and logged on with system. But logged in as administrator. If this had like 20 million items in it, you might find this page takes a long time to load. And it's because of that security trimming operation going on in the background. Or you'll get an error. A little error count, which basically it doesn't mean the scope's broken. It just means that the scope is taking too long to render. And the other thing was result removal. Again, URLs to remove. I'm not going to put one in here because it will cause chaos. If I was to put something like, it has to be a real one though, so it won't actually show in the. I'm going to put internet, and that's a deliberate typo. Just because I don't want to dump the contents of my index. It might complain saying that the service application doesn't exist. If I did a remove now, what it would do is it would go and find everything related to that web application. In fact, it has to be an exact URL. So normally that would be like a single document or a single list item. It would go and remove that item from the object by nulling out its security. And then it would add into here a crawl rule. If it found the item in the index, obviously it didn't in that case, it would add a crawl rule here to say exclude this item from crawl. So you would never see it in the crawl again. And scopes we just had a look at. Okay, metadata properties was the other one. So the values we looked at in here, if we look at the managed properties that we have, most people, if you're dealing with search environments, you should be working with these and making best use of these. The one I showed you before was contents hidden. Contents hidden is an interesting one in that it's actually a property which is used to expose people data by default in the search center. So all of these values in here will automatically get pushed up and available for querying and constructing queries against and displaying information about when you're doing people searches. It's the only one that does it. And if you ever get to experience where you've added a user profile property to a user and you're trying to search on that property, so maybe you add a custom cost center, for example, and you try and query against that cost center and it's not appearing in search results, the reason why is because you've not added it into here. Typically, you have to add it into here. Once it's in here, we get all values added because we've got the first value mapped there, and it will get propagated up to appear in the search results. So basically, when you build your custom XSLT or your custom string of retrieved properties in your search center, which some of the other folks have been doing in other sessions, if the value is in this list, then it's automatically going to appear without you having to go and create a separate retrieval for it. Okay, it'll just appear automatically. And these are our values down here. So this is, and this was saying before, you see the equality, inequality when we do the tick box. So basically we're saying, show me people who have work phone of, and it will do that. Show me people who have home phone or whatever, and it will bring those values back. It doesn't allow you to do things like ranges, as I said already. Okay. My thing's not working. Ah, there we go. Okay, so just a little bit deeper then. A few other things that we've not mentioned already. Stop words, thesauruses, query suggestions, trimming, policies, and tuning. Time are we on? 10 minutes. So we're going to look at each of these in turn, just very briefly. And all I want to do is ask if any of you actually use these things. Does anyone configure stop words? Noise words, you might know them as. No? One? Sort of. Two. What about thesaurus or custom dictionaries? One. And does anyone play around with security descriptors? Query suggestions at all? Yeah. Okay, so let's have a look at what they are. So stop word files, recommendation, don't bother, right? There's very little value in them. The scenarios changed between 2007 and 2010. In 2007, whenever you modified the stop word file or the noise word file, which basically says any words in this file, automatically exclude them from the index and automatically remove them from any query that I submit to the index. In 2010, they only apply to query time. They don't apply to indexing. So now what you can do in 2010 is if you add new data into the stop word file, you don't have to recrawl everything to make them actually work because they only apply to query time. One of the problems is if they were included at index time, we'd lose the ability to do phrase matching. So in 2010 in the search engine, you can do specific phrase queries. If we included them or if we removed the noise words from the index at indexing time, phrase matching would break. So we'd lose that ability to do that feature. And it's very simple to configure. There's a file under the application UID config, which is literally called noises or ENU for English, and you just add the list of text items into there. The thesaurus is slightly more interesting in that you have the concept of what we call replacement sets and expansion sets. Not used very often, as we can see, a couple of people in the audience. Basically, it allows you to do things like do replacements. So let's say I want to do a search for SharePoint or search for portal server and replace it with SharePoint. Every time I do that query, this is the kind of thing you can do through this thesaurus. So you can do things what we call replacement sets and expansion sets. So in the top example there, what's going to happen is if I issued a search for portal server, the search engine would automatically replace that query with the word SharePoint and the word foundation to replace those values. And then the expansion sets at the bottom, if I was to do a search for any of these terms, so writer, author, or journalist, it would automatically include the other terms as well. So it's basically allowing me to do query expansion. Not the same as query expansion in FAST, but query expansion all the same. The interesting one at the top with the replacement sets, I did see somebody who built a thesaurus containing just about every profanity you could find. They added it to this and substituted it with a link that raised a best bet for the Internet Acceptable Use Policy. So they kind of told their employees to stop searching for those words or they're going to get sacked. The other thing, custom dictionary, I've only ever seen this used once, one simple application, was a developer who decided that the word breaker in SharePoint, so if you're not familiar with the word breaker, it basically takes all those words that come out the index, chops them up into chunks, and then submits them into the index. So basically, if you've got some quite complex words, specifically compound words in Dutch or German, you will get some word breaking experiences that you might not like. Well, the custom dictionary can allow you to overcome some of those scenarios. So if, let's say, to quote the specific example I came across was a developer who was trying to search for his namespaces as 4-part names in his code. Now, when he was searching for those, the word breaker finds all the period signs in between those namespaces and just splits them apart. So you never find anything. By adding all these namespaces into a custom dictionary, he basically allowed the search engine to preserve those namespaces in the index as unique entities, and therefore he could search them quite easily. Made life a lot easier for him. That's one specific example. Very, very, and again, a few people said they used them. I don't know many that do these days. Query suggestions, on the other hand, are obviously new in 2010 and very, very useful. They allow us to use the little drop-down. So when you're in a search center and you start typing away for the results and you get the drop-down that gives you the kind of type-ahead experience, or suggestions of, did you mean, not so much did you mean, but searching for different types of queries based on the text that you're typing or the query that you've done. This allows you to add values into there. So you can kind of preempt what people might want to search for and almost like preload the search application with data. Whereas if you don't do this, those values will appear eventually, but they just take a while. It's only after users have searched for so many terms so many times that they'll start to appear in the drop-down straight away. So it just makes life a little bit easier, cosmetically easier for your end users. This one's an interesting one. The query processor, as I mentioned before, that activity that the query processor does by taking all of its data, taking the result sets, smashing them together, security trimming them down, going back to the admin DB to do its access check, is an expensive operation. By default, in 2010 RTM, we cached 1,000 credentials, or 1,000 sets of ACLs, if you like, in the query processor. What's 1,000 unique ACLs? That's not a lot when you consider that the search applications out there, just raw SharePoint search applications with 10, 15, 20 million objects. That's a lot of round trips to the database to refresh that cache. So you can change this value. You can set it up here. Security trim cache size. If I've got time, I'll do it for you on this demo. But it's a very, very simple process to do. You look at the content, look at the search admin DB, select count from MSS security descriptors, with no lock, of course. And that will tell you how many unique ACLs you have in your entire search environment. You should then set that value. I haven't said it on the screen, but you should set that value to be the same, or 10% bigger, because you're only ever going to discover new things in terms of search security. So by setting this value, I mean, to give an example, we've changed it to 10,000 after SP1 as the default value. MSIT internally, we run our security descriptor cache with 500,000 objects in it, just to really bump it up. The memory footprint's tiny. It's like 12 bytes per ACL or something. It's really, really small. So you can get away with a lot, but it will seriously improve the query rate. If you're in a scenario where your users are complaining that search is taking too long, there's two things that's going to happen. It's either slow query against disk, or it's slow security trimming. And if it's slow security trimming, you can see that in the ULS log. There's literally a value that says query timings in the ULS log, an entry. Under query timing, you will have a property that says SEC, which is security. How long does it take to do security trimming? If that's a high number, this is your problem. Bump this value up. There's no harm in bumping it up, it's just as general best practice anyway. A couple of other bits and pieces then. So crawl policies. In 2007, the crawl policy was fairly straightforward. If I can't find you, I will delete you. Straightforward. Yeah. That object's not there the second time I try and index it, so I'm going to dump it. In 2010, we have more control, but it also leads to some confusion, because the crawl policies basically say, how do we behave when things that are in the index are no longer discoverable? So if it's SharePoint content, for example, we'll hit this delete policy for all other errors, or the top two values here. Depending on whether we find the object or not, will depend on how we actually behave. So let's say the delete policy for access denied. So if I suddenly deny my search crawler account access to the content DB by modifying the policy for the web application, for example, I'm not immediately going to dump everything out the index, because the system, I'm not saying it knows that's probably a problem, but it recognizes that it has these values, which basically says, I need to get a consecutive number of 30 errors over a 720-hour period before I really believe that I'm no longer allowed access to that item. So just by being access denied to the web app will not immediately dump your index from that web application. It will take this amount of time. That might be too long for some people. You might deliberately want that data out the search index, in which case you'd reduce those values. The other one, the delete unvisited, controls, well, how do I behave if I access content? Let's say, for example, if it's SharePoint content, the delete unvisited method of 1 literally means don't delete anything now. If it was web content, on the other hand, by modifying the delete unvisited method, I could control it and say, actually, if I'm crawling out on the internet and don't find something, I'm not able to go and visit that site, I'll set this value to 0, which means I'll just delete everything. because there's a good chance if I'm crawling out on the web and something's not accessible, it's probably gone. It could be just depending on what type of content I'm accessing. So you can really kind of hone in and control how SharePoint search engine behaves when it can't find the data it's looking for or the data you're expecting it to find. Rather than in the 2007 experience, drop everything. A few things about performance. So I'm conscious of time. I think I'm just on time. We've got a couple of minutes. Indexing performance. So by modifying the values here, we talked earlier about the crawler impact rules that can do denial of service on your farm. This is another guy that can do a similar thing. You can set the values. In 2007, we had a little control slider. In 2010, we don't have that. We just have the ability through PowerShell to set it to reduce, partly reduced, or maximum, which basically says how many threads is my crawler allowed to use. The higher you make it, in theory, the faster the crawl will be, unless you end up starving the host that you're trying to crawl. So you could just do a DOS attack on the service you're trying to hit. The maximum value and the partly reduced value, in theory, if you hit the maximum limit, they'll come out the same. So you can't go higher. But the one thing the maximum value does do is set the thread count or set the number of threads or the actual threads themselves to be high priority threads. So maximum will give you a slight boost on performance of a crawl engine via the priority of the thread. I don't know how many slides I've got left. So one other thing for indexing performance, these are critical. Does anybody set these values at all? No. Okay, so just to let you know, in one of our O365 dedicated farms, we left these as default. The search engine in SharePoint assumes you only have 4 gig of RAM in the box. Right? It just assumes that. There's no one in this room will have a SharePoint server running with 4 gig of RAM, because it's unsupported, right? By doubling these values, we boosted the crawl rate from 60 docs per second to 350 documents per second, just by doubling those values in those registry parameters. They default to 100 meg, and it's the amount of data, it's the amount of memory that the filter processes, the iFilters that are loaded and the filter daemons are allowed to use to process data and process documents. If you double it, you'll get at least a 3- or 4-fold input or throughput increase on crawling, usually. Obviously, it's hardware specific, etc. But it's a very good way to boost the amount of throughput you get on your crawl engine. And then other bits and pieces, so crawl database maintenance, limiting the log data retention time. So it's very important specifically for HTTP-only crawlers, the crawl log or the log retention in the crawl DB can be enormous, especially if you're out crawling over internet sites where you might get lots of errors back, dead links and all that kind of thing. Your log will fill up with just garbage. This is an example, that was a real example. 600 gig crawl DB, crawling a few SharePoint apps and a website, generated over 385 gigs of garbage data in the crawl log. That's a big footprint just on backup, and it's garbage, it's not even real useful data. By reducing the interval to 30 days from the default of 90, we basically dumped a third of that straight away, and we're even considering reducing it lower than that, because it's data you don't really need unless you're going to try and do some kind of forensic investigation on your crawl logs. It doesn't affect the view of the log in the admin interface where you go show crawl log. It doesn't affect that at all, but it just affects the amount of data you're actually storing in there. A few other bits and pieces, so crawl targets. Am I over time? 1 hour. Using a specific crawl target, so disabling the throttling is very useful if you're planning on hitting a specific machine. So if you have a specific server in your farm that you want to hit to do your crawling, disable the throttling on it. Don't let it take part in the HTTP throttling exercise, where it's going to start throttling back your crawler. You want to get maximum throughput out of it. So push as much as you can through there. So only turn it off on local. Notice it's only turned off on the local service, not on the web application itself. And that's how you configure the crawl target to actually set which particular crawl target, which particular servers is your crawl target here. So it's which particular server do I want to hit when I'm crawling this particular URL. So again, configure the crawl target, configure the source. And then the other things you would do might be restrict the resource that it can do. So I mentioned about boosting it by shutting down the throttle. The other side of that is, well, what if I want to let company A crawl my farm B, or my farm that belongs to company B. So in the O365, again, to use that analogy, in dedicated space, we allow on-premises crawl engines to crawl SharePoint O365 dedicated search farms or farms. What we do is we do something called SQL resource governing. So we build them a crawl target, we turn the throttle off, but then we restrict how much CPU they can take off the farm by using the SQL resource governor, which is a very simple thing to do. I don't have time for the demo, I don't think. But what you do with the resource governor is you basically say, you create a function, and the function would be hostname, for example, return hostname. So as this request comes into SQL, the function evaluates the hostname that the request came from, which will be your crawl target, and it can, using the resource grouping mechanism, it can throttle back and say, I'm going to allow this target to have X% CPU. And when it reaches X% CPU, I'm going to kill how much else it can use. So it really kind of throttles back and controls how much data, how much throughput that, and how much impact that search crawler can have on your farm. So it prevents the users from having a poor experience. And I don't have time for this, I'm afraid. Unless anyone wants to talk about it. I think we're out of time. Out of time, Bob? 5 minutes, okay. So, 5 minutes, I'll quickly go through this then in that case. For anyone that can wait. Okay, so, nice and simple. He says. Except I can't open a folder. Okay, so I mentioned about the script, about doing the various control mechanisms. In terms of the query suggestions, that's a very straightforward one. I mentioned that already. I'll speed things along, I won't do this. But this is a very, very, very simple thing to do in terms of specifying what your language ID is, and then literally adding in the names of those suggestions. Because I'm not really showing the search center, we're not going to see very much anyway if I do that. The one that might be of more interest generally is the resource governor in SQL. Which is blank. No. It's in here. Okay, so when we create a resource governor in SQL, if I go to one of the SQL boxes, we'll just cripple everybody else now. All the resource governor does, it's just a very simple rule. Literally just saying, connections from here, restrict it to this amount of CPU, or when the target CPU is reached, don't allow it to have any more. So that's my query. I'll just set up the master DB first. And then all we're going to do is create this function. So the resource governor, if I go to the resource governor now, which is down under management, resource governor, and do new resource pool, we see this thing called the classifier function name, and that's what we use to determine what mechanism or what property of the incoming request to SQL is going to dictate what we do with it. So in this case, we want to say requests coming from a specific host name will be throttled back to only use a certain amount of CPU, and that will be our target server. So by going in here, I run this function. So I'm basically adding a function in. We register that function, which is just simply saying make it available for the resource governor. If I then go back to here and do new pool, I can see I have my function in place, host classifier, so host name. And I can modify these values by adding, wherever it's gone, I'm on add. Is it not letting me modify? Oh, okay, turn it on first. What? Oh. Sorry. It should have executed those and done the changes. And it starts spinning it. Sure if that's going to do it. Sorry, SQL demos have not been my week for that, I'm afraid. I'm in the wrong DB. What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? I'm in the right database. Why is it not working? Wayne, SQL guy. I can't remember the name of the command. Okay, I'm going to cheat. Are the devs using SQL 01? Okay, their session should be over. I'm the IT guy. I'm the admin. It's not production, right? So this is how you wouldn't do it. What do I know? I'm a search engineer.
You're connected to the Office 365 operations team?
Yep. But I don't touch SQL, usually. And I certainly wouldn't do that in that environment. Although I know people that do. Right, give me some pen, there we go, right. So if you forget the SQL command to run, you just restart SQL. So there's our classifier, and once we've done this, we can go in and set the, we can configure various values in here, we can set priorities and set all kinds of things in here in terms of how we go away and control the resources. So I'm going to end there, because I think that's definitely the end of the session, because people are coming into the next one. But basically that's how you would configure, and you basically go in and set values for CPU, minimum, maximum. You can set an additional resource pool, so we should be able to add in, for example, a new resource pool. So that would be my crawl target in there, and specifically it would be the host name, so SPO3 for example is my crawler, and I would set minimum CPU 5, maximum CPU 15, and so on and so forth, and I could configure those properties to associate that value. So as soon as the crawler started to crawl and the SQL Server saw requests from SPO3, it would throttle it back to this amount of resource. And it would basically say, to prevent the end users from getting throttled when they hit web front ends. So I'm going to end there for 10 minutes. And I'm hoping the next session, the demos will be slightly more exciting. If they go wrong, though, they'll go spectacularly wrong and take down the whole search infrastructure. Thank you.